it was unanimous in the end because this new Ratcliffe-led sporting regime realised very quickly that they only had one decision.
So Ruud van Nistelrooy has departed Old Trafford for a second time as the Ruben Amorim era begins at Manchester United. The Dutchman did wave goodbye with a third win in 4 and further impressive individual performances to whet the appetite. We're going to touch on all of that and more in your latest instalment of the Theatre of Red. You are very welcome to your weekly episode of the Theatre of Red, the 27th instalment, if you can believe that. Ironically, we are pretty much 6 months to the day of episode 1, and I felt it fitting to bring the man who opened the show alongside me back to say hello. Mr. Ben Jacobs, how's everything with you, sir?
Good to be back. I'm glad that doing the first show didn't derail the podcast and you're still going strong.
We managed to keep the ship slightly above water anyway, thanks in large part to your undeniably brilliant appearance, sir, so don't be underselling that in any way. The one thing that I will say is a hell of a lot has changed since we last spoke on air, namely the departure of Erik ten Hag, the arrival and the departure of Ruud van Nistelrooy, the beginning of a new era with our second Portuguese tactician in Mr. Ruben Amorim. Now, Ruud waved goodbye to a tearful Stretford end following a comprehensive 3-0 victory against your beloved Foxes, a second in as many weeks. Admittedly, I had expected a slightly different outcome, a sterner test from the League Cup encounter, given the significant number of changes that your side made for that. But nonetheless, a Vardy-less Leicester were dispatched in about as competent a manner as we have witnessed this season from any Manchester United side. We now head into another international break with some semblance of positivity in the theatre of dreams. Leicester have never really enjoyed their time against Manchester United, but how did you find the fixture as a whole and the performance from United on the day?
I thought that United were excellent. They were clinical. You get that buzz, don't you, even with an interim manager, especially when he's a club legend like Ruud van Nistelrooy. And it was good to see Bruno Fernandes put in a captain's performance on his 250th career appearance for Manchester United. I thought that Casemiro was strong as well. There was a clean sheet in there to boot. Leicester were not brilliant. I don't think the 4-3-3 that Steve Cooper decided to go with particularly matched very well to Manchester United's 4-2-3-1, and there might not seem a big difference between those formations, but Fatawu and Boanote play relatively wide, whereas Bruno Fernandes is trying to get right in behind Rasmus Højlund, and both Ugarte and Casemiro did really well to close up the midfield and drag in Harry Winks and Wilfred Ndidi into very central positions. Leicester couldn't get any width, and Manchester United were able to kind of bend them out of shape, and that also allowed Dalot, when he was on the pitch, and Mazraoui to get forwards as well. So it was comfortable from Manchester United, and that's what you're looking for under Ruben Amorim. The starting point is identity and home dominance, and if you get those two right, it's good foundations to then build and start competing somewhere closer to the top 4 and Champions League football.
I do think it's rather amusing, given one point that you made about the inability for your side to be able to impact it as a result of Casemiro and Ugarte, because if we had gone back, we'll say 2 months, and Erik ten Hag was in charge, we probably would have seen a repetition of the imbalance that we had in midfield. There was so much openness, and it just seemed that on a weekly basis, as much as I wanted to defend Erik ten Hag, maybe allowing some form of romanticism to think that he was going to come out the other end of it okay, and that we were going to see some sort of positive shoots if we just stuck by a manager. We must remember, you can take a performance like West Ham. Manchester United were fantastic in the first half and probably could have been 5 or 6 goals to the good at half time. Realistically, the only real difference between Ten Hag and Van Nistelrooy's tenure was they actually put the ball in the back of the net. But one large tactical tweak that he did make was bringing Manuel Ugarte in from the start, because he started all 4 fixtures, and placing him beside Casemiro. I thought the two of them complement each other so well. And if one of them is slightly far forward, the other one automatically knows to drop slightly further back to be able to provide some sort of cover. They smother the midfield. They make it almost impossible in all 4 fixtures that we've looked at for any of the opposition midfield to really embrace themselves. Even if you go back to the Chelsea game, when you've got Caicedo, who's a fantastic midfield player, and even he found it difficult against the guys in the central midfield. in moving forward with Amorim, as you've made mention to, we're going to cover in a moment. I know he's going to look into a new system and a new dynamic with a 3-4-3, but that still circulates around having two central midfielders being an optimum focal point in the heart of midfield. Just how much of Ugarte's inevitable revelation in midfield following his transition period is going to benefit Casemiro in being able to prolong his career in the Northwest? Because obviously when we spoke 6 months ago, it was looking increasingly likely that he was going to be heading out the door.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, first of all, about the partnership between Ugarte and Casemiro. And it comes back also to this home dominance thing, which, as I said before, is underrated. Because if teams come into Old Trafford and they're more inclined to park the bus, they're more inclined to adapt their tactical style because there's a fear factor about Manchester United, then what that should mean is more of the ball for Manchester United and less pressure on Casemiro. And if Ugarte can help him out in that respect as well, then really what you want is Ugarte to be your engine room. He can get box to box, but also play in defensive midfield and offer some protection to what, as we know, under Amorim will be a back three rather than a back four. But as importantly, if he's there adding that energy and that intelligence, Casemiro's already got the positional awareness, and from deep positions, he can become very much a midfield metronome in that, well, we should just say Casemiro mold, but I was going to say Toni Kroos, who can pick a pass. And Casemiro with time, and Casemiro not having to look over his shoulder as much, and Casemiro not being used out of position, that player is still there. The challenge for Casemiro is when he's pressed or when he's forced into uncomfortable positions. And that's when maybe age or even application at times maybe get the better of him. So that partnership is very encouraging for sure. Naturally, we have to think about a fit Kobbie Mainoo being a staple of this Manchester United side as well. But the beauty for Ruben Amorim is that in this 3-4-3, you have the ability, because your centre-backs can squeeze in, and this will benefit Lenny Yoro as well, your central midfielders don't always have to worry about what's behind them. They will offer protection, but the whole point going forwards is that you have the width because you're playing 3 and a 4 in midfield, and then the 2 in the centre have to just worry about being almost old-fashioned central midfielders that are direct, that can penetrate, that can be creative. Off the ball, a bit of pace and a bit of cover is very important, because you will also see the centre-backs under Ruben Amorim, when not pressed, push forwards and adopt quite a high line. But central midfielders under Amorim are old-school central midfielders. And if Casemiro is given time and can develop a partnership with Ugarte or anybody else, he could still have a future at Manchester United. And ultimately, Amorim will judge that. But I tell you something, whether he starts or whether he's on the bench, it's also about, is he galvanized? Is he excited by this challenge? Does he have a kind of second wind and a hunger to keep on gaining trophies and pushing Manchester United up the table? And that leadership element, that unity element, whether for Casemiro from the start or from the bench, is very important. And maybe as a bench player, he can even be more impactful in some of the games that he doesn't start. And that's one of the big things that I'll be looking for from Ruben Amorim, how he knits this squad together stylistically, but also in terms of the different characters as well. Because even against Leicester, I look at that bench and I think it certainly doesn't have the depth of Man City or Arsenal or Chelsea. Xerxes been hit and miss so far. Eriksen shows his best in flashes, but not necessarily consistently 90 minutes over 90 minutes. Garnacho naturally is a player that excites, and whether him or Ahmad, whoever comes off the bench, definitely someone we can call depth. And then you've got Johnny Evans, Lindelof, Mount and Anthony. They're not form players, but they've all got potential. And Casemiro has fallen into that category as well under Erik ten Hag. Perhaps not when he first joined, but certainly towards the back end of Ten Hag's tenure. So I'm intrigued to see how Amorim, not just the manager and the tactician, but the man manager, can get the best out of these kind of players. And hopefully we've seen a little flash that Casemiro can still cut it with the best under Ruud van Nistelrooy. And now it's up to Ruben Amorim to try and keep that form and momentum going.
I'm very, very keen to see if he does fall into that old adage of square pegs and round holes, as we've seen various other tacticians over the last 2 decades fall into. But no sooner had the fixture come and gone against Leicester, and speculation obviously began circulating about the future of Ruud van Nistelrooy, due to the impending arrival of Amorim and obviously his trusted backroom team. Inevitably, Ruud has departed alongside Rene Hake, 2 further coaches as well. I know that many die-hard Reds, they were hoping that Van Nistelrooy could remain in some capacity, prolong his outstanding relationship with the club. But deep down, I believe that the majority, they were aware of the incoming head coach, his requirements and the potential implications of having a previous interim manager working alongside the players on a daily basis. With Amorim, supporters are now looking forward to embracing a 6th permanent manager post Sir Alex Ferguson. And there's optimism beginning to increase with the prospect of his well-known 3-4-3 structure, as we've made mention to. And that's going to obviously supply an inevitable shake-up to the first team squad. Having dispatched Pep Guardiola and his Manchester City in Europe, I thought it was very, very fitting that the Lisbon man then sort of waved goodbye to Sporting in true Manchester United fashion of old by coming from behind to outscore the opposition and winning in a 4-2 fixture. It felt very Fergie-ish, very Manchester United about it. Overall, there's so many aspects to consider with his appointment. Obviously, his age being 39 years of age. He's only going to be about a year and a half older than Johnny Evans, as you've made mention to. and he's got all of this new dynamic coming in that he's grown with in Braga, then on to Sporting Lisbon, and now on to Manchester United. There's so much to look at with it. From one aspect, Ineos have been judged and scrutinised for various different factors, such as their decision to prolong on with Erik ten Hag, down to the most recent decision about the away ticket allocation and the manner in which they're handling that and the expenses that have been cut on supporters. But on the other aspect, the manner in which they acted so quickly, following waving goodbye to Ten Hag, to act and to get this man over the line as quickly as they have, has been truly impressive, and that's been recognised across the board. As a whole, how do you view the appointment at this stage of the Ineos journey?
I think the appointment is interesting because on the one hand, it shows a new football strategy of which we have a head coach rather than a manager. And unlike Erik ten Hag, Ruben Amorim doesn't have a recruitment veto. But on the other hand, it somewhat undermines the thorough summer process to keep Erik ten Hag. Now, naturally, Manchester United would argue 2 things. Number one, when that summer review took place, Omar Barada and Dan Ashworth hadn't formally started. And number 2, football's just football, right? So Manchester United genuinely wanted it to work with Erik ten Hag, which is why they extended his contract and didn't replace him during the summer. But Manchester United off to their worst start in terms of when Ten Hag left anyway, statistically, in the Premier League era. So there's not much you can do other than replace the manager. So I think we see a number of things here. Number one is that Jim Ratcliffe and his team are not going to hang around. Number 2, some of those voices that came in a little bit later are suddenly starting to influence the process. And number 3, Manchester United, in a very positive way, like getting Omar Barada from Manchester City, are able to go and get somebody who is best in class on their terms and without this so-called Manchester United tax, if you like, as well. And that's very exciting for me because Ruben Amorim, people believed, was destined to replace Pep Guardiola at Manchester City, perhaps even more so after the sporting director, which is difficult to say, but grammatically correct. After the sporting director, Hugo Viana, went to the Etihad Stadium and will, of course, formally start at the end of the season. All of that added up to maybe Ruben Amorim will end up in the blue half of Manchester. Then you had Ruben Amorim say, even if he was to join Manchester United, he'd like to do so at the end of this season. And Manchester United said, no, this is a negotiation on our terms. And as a consequence, Amorim had to make a very quick decision, start now or lose the opportunity. So the level of ambition, the hands-on nature, the best-in-class sporting team being built, for me anyway, trumps the fact that they dilly-dallied a little bit over the summer, did a big review, and then went against that review within a matter of weeks into the new season. That is football, and it will come under scrutiny. But I think what would have been worse is just to say, okay, it's not working with Ten Hag for whatever reason. We've bought for Ten Hag. We've spent a lot of money. We've just got to keep giving it longer and longer and longer and longer, because that's when the rot kind of sets in. So the decisiveness may expose competing opinions and a bit of a U-turn on the summer review, but better that than just be distant, sit back and wait for the kind of inevitable Ten Hag exit that I think it had got to the point where that would come, whether it was October, November, December, January, however long you were going to leave it. So this clean break makes it a bit harder for Amorim because you're coming in mid-season. But I think on balance, as difficult as the decision was, it was unanimous in the end, because this new Ratcliffe-led sporting regime realised very quickly that they only had one decision, and that was, unfortunately, they had to move on from Ten Hag. And now Amorim coming in should be a very exciting appointment for Manchester United.
You made mention that the timing now may make it difficult for him as he's coming in mid-season. But on the other hand, it'll allow him the trump card to be able to say that he was dealt a dud hand, and it's going to take a little bit of time for him to be able to settle with that. On the manager himself, I obviously referenced my curiosity about seeing how he's going to embrace his squad, utilise his players in completely transitioning the philosophy and the tactical structure that's there. I used the reference point of square pegs and round holes. Now, given the information that I've received from individuals close to the club, it would appear quite clear that he is indeed going to begin with his favourite tactics and his philosophy. And that obviously leaves many to speculate about which attacking players are going to fall victim to this newfound philosophy at the club. We have the real possibility of 2 10s sitting behind Rasmus Højlund. Not necessarily in a wide position, but in 2 10s. And you've got Bruno Fernandes, who is pretty much assured of his role, particularly with his return to form, which has been fantastic. That in itself is going to leave Marcus Rashford, Alejandro Garnacho, Amad Diallo and Mason Mount all essentially battling for another position. I do welcome the competition for places, as I do with Casemiro looking rejuvenated at 32 and obviously Kobbie Mainoo coming back in, and he's going to be integral, because every football team should have this if that team wishes to compete at the highest level. And regardless of whether or not Manchester United are playing in the Champions League, they're in the Europa League, and especially with this new format, there's increased fixtures, there's massive congestion, and there's an inability to be able to just go with the same starting 11 on a weekly basis. However, given everything that we know, it has almost become a perennial struggle with Manchester United and fullbacks, with Luke Shaw, Tyrell Malacia all being injured, and Diogo Dalot and Nasser Mazraoui having to deputise and change from the left to the right. That said, on Tuesday evening, Tyrell Malacia has returned to the starting 11 for the under-21s, which is fantastic to see after such a prolonged period out. But how do you see this ideology playing out within the current squad? And could we see some innovation in terms of deployments like Marcus Rashford or Alejandro Garnacho being utilised almost in full back molds in this new system?
Yeah, very possibly. That's the most interesting thing, isn't it? That if you are both confident in your wide back three and their positional sense to squeeze in when needed, and you've got 2 central midfielders in this 3-4-3 system that we expect Amorim to play that can also drop back, then your fullbacks have freedom and can actually be wingers or wide midfielders as long as they've got the defensive-minded qualities. But that may require a little bit of sculpting with some of the names that you mention. I think that Marcus Rashford should be a winner in this system because he can play behind the lead striker in a very effective role. I think the same might apply, by the way, to somebody like Mason Mount as well, who thrived a few seasons ago scoring goals for Chelsea when allowed a bit more freedom to play centrally, but hasn't really clicked yet at Manchester United and has picked up some injuries as well. I think the biggest loser of both the system and the manager might be Antony. And it will be interesting to see what Amorim feels he needs in the market, because Ten Hag was backed with a number of names. And therefore, when Amorim looks at what he needs, there will also be the reality of what Manchester United can afford and who Manchester United can get as well. So it's obvious, for example, if you look at Sporting, and I'm not saying specifically that Amorim is going to raid, but in a dream world, there will be players in that squad that Amorim likes and thinks are good enough for Manchester United, most notably Diomande at the back and Gyokeres at the front. But if Amorim says that's the solution, bring in another centre-back that can help in that back three and have more of a goal-scoring focal point than Rasmus Højlund is at the moment. And Joshua Zirkzee can play anywhere across the front line, so it doesn't necessarily mean that he's out, because you might see him playing behind in the same way that Trincao and Gonçalves do or did at Sporting under Amorim. So he's a little bit more flexible. But obviously for this system to work, in addition to Lenny Yoro, who's seen as a generational talent, it might be that one more centre-back is needed. So people will naturally say Diomande, and the priority is still probably going to be to bring in more of a prolific goal scorer to compete with Rasmus Højlund and Joshua Zirkzee. But to get Diomande and Gyokeres, you need the best part of 200 million. And even with a slightly reduced price compared to Gyokeres' release clause, that's still going to be somewhere set around the 75 million mark. And there might be add-ons. And Diomande is probably going to be 80, 85 million because Sporting are going to be a bit more bullish. So it's not as easy as saying, how do you get the system to work? You add a couple of Sporting players he likes. You've got to be able to afford those players. If he's dealing with what he's got, then I think Lenny Yoro will be born to play in this kind of system. And that may make a massive difference. And we haven't obviously seen him playing competitively for Manchester United yet, but he's young and may need a bit of time. I think Agate, as we mentioned right at the top, will be somebody that not only obviously knows this kind of style and manager, but can slot very easily into the system, changing slightly from how he currently plays at Manchester United, but not in a great deal, because the central midfielders now, if we look at how Ruud utilised them and under Ruben Amorim, will be doing largely the same things. And then, I'm most intrigued to see how one or two of the other in and out players do, and can they get consistency and thrive? And there will be a lot of focus on either Højlund and goals or somebody like Zirkzee and having to click. I think Mazraoui and De Ligt both love to get forwards and should be relatively confident and calm playing in this system. But the one that I'm looking at, which might sound like a bit of a surprise to people looking, is Mount. Because in Mount, there is still a £50 million player there. And there is a goal scorer, and there is a creative spark, and there is somebody that can cause damage and problems. But you basically have to go back about three and a half seasons to see him at his best. But this kind of system is perfect for Mason Mount if he gets opportunities. So he's the one I'm looking forward to seeing whether he can finally get up and running in a Manchester United shirt under Ruben Amorim.
I could not agree more with that last bit, Ben, because you can ask anybody who I'm connected to in these circles. I'm one of the very few who has been chanting Mason Mount's name since he came to the football club. I spent hours trying to convince people of how his technical ability can actually benefit the football team. It was a lot more difficult under Erik ten Hag's system because ultimately people didn't understand what ten Hag was trying to achieve. When you look at a Ruben Amorim system and you've got two men sitting behind a striker and in front of a midfield, it is tailor-made for Thomas Tuchel's Mason Mount that was getting recognition towards Ballon d'Or nominations. As well as that, I also think, as you mentioned with Joshua Zirkzee, his playmaking ability and his interchange and his ability to link players will also fall fantastically in that role between the striker and the midfield. One man that I do want to mention, and it's a man that many people will be keen to see retain his regular playing time, is Garnacho. And the 20-year-old, he's an obvious talent. He's got the ability to grow into an extremely important player for his football club and for his nation. But he's been the subject of much scrutiny in recent weeks. And this obviously accelerated with the nonsensical content from a YouTuber making its way around social media in the past week. I know, as well as you do, that footballers are accustomed to being abused. It is nothing new. And this nonsense, generally speaking, is from a very small cohort of people who call themselves supporters. But it remains something that I refuse to abide. I think it's despicable. And it's evident that a younger generation like Garnacho are going to be affected by this. I mean, you only need to look at his muted celebrations following his beautiful strike against Yi at the weekend. And Bruno's comments thereafter about his confidence and feelings afterwards about the supporters. Asking you directly as a man who's worked in the industry as long as you have, I'm curious. How do you view the Argentine scenario presently when factoring in his response against your side on Sunday?
Well, it was a superb goal. That's the first thing to say. And I think we fall for this trap time and time again, where we forget the player's age, because young players now are such athletes. They get opportunities. They're good enough. They get thrown straight in. But you often still have to wait for that consistency. And there's so many examples of that. Cole Palmer spent 2 seasons at Man City, barely getting a game. and then broke through at Chelsea, but that wasn't his first Premier League season. And if you look at Garnacho, then yes, for somebody still so young, he's played a lot of games for Manchester United because he's been there since 2021, 2022. And the game time has increased season on season and season. And by the way, so is the output as well, because in that first season, I think he only played a couple of Premier League games. In the second full season, he played 30 odd games, but only, I would say, 20 odd in the Premier League. And I think he scored 3 or 4 league goals and maybe like 5 in all competitions. Last season, he played virtually every Premier League game. And I think it was 7 goals and 10 in all competitions. And the stats so far this season are actually really strong. I think it's 18 games and 7 goals. So he's going to keep surpassing his tally. And when you're judging a player, you almost want them that young to be doing a few rudimental things wrong, because they're the easy things to fix. And it's always just down to a lack of game time, or there hasn't been consistency of manager or style or dressing room or anything. I'm not specifically talking about Manchester United and Garnacho now. And then one day, when they get to 2021, 22, 23, they click. So if you make a really basic error, and it can be easily fixed, therefore, that's a good thing. What you don't want is a player to be inherently slow or lack intelligence or be old enough that you don't think they're going to improve anymore. So I'm not a Manchester United fan, and I'm not a believer in bashing players, prejudging players, putting undue pressure on them. And I understand the fan sentiment and emotion, and there always has to be respect and there always has to be a line. I've not seen the video that you're alluding to, but bashing anybody, making it personal, adding extra pressure, using needless language, abusing, we got to stamp it out the game. And because I'm not part of that emotional cycle, unless we're talking about Leicester, of course, I'm just thinking about his cold, hard numbers. And I'm seeing a player that's got 7 goals in all competitions, that only scored 10 goals in all competitions last season, that scored 5 the season before. So there's basically a chance that he goes from 5, doubles up to 10, which I think he did last season. And then if he got to 20 this season, and he's certainly on track for that, that's progress, that's output. And all the other rough edge things and any other criticism, they're by the by, because if the player's playing more and scoring more and getting goal contributions, the rest will come, because we mustn't forget that one thing, that he's 20 years of age. And I think in this digital age and in this gamified age of things like FIFA, so often you've got a card of the player, you've got a shirt of the player, you've got a video of the player, you've got the gamified version of the player, you've got the avatar of the player, you might even have something like the Bitcoin now of the player. And you forget that human aspect because you're so used to playing on FIFA, seeing the attributes which are basically informed by reality, but they're still just numbers. And it creates this generation of fans that go, well, his pace should be 85. His finishing should be 90. I play with him on FIFA and he's really good. I've seen the highlights reel. I've heard other people on social media constantly talking about him. And you forget that this is a 20-year-old kid whose numbers are just improving. And that's really the most important thing. And if I was Ruben Amorim, I would just be setting him that task, whether as a starter or whether as a bench impact player, to go and score those wonder goals, to have that confidence to know that he can shoot from anywhere, to run and have one-on-ones. And then on that training field, the other parts of the finesse will come. And at the end of this season, if a 20-year-old Garnacho ends up doubling up those numbers again, he will have been one of Manchester United's most impactful and outstanding players. And that, for me, is really the only thing that matters, because once that player knows at the age of 20, 21, 22, they can be in that double figures. And it will be more, of course, if you include the goal contributions as well. It gives them that confidence and that platform to then go on and have 6, 7, 8 years of consistency. And it feels like Garnacho's almost there. Everybody knows the talent's there, but he's almost there at the point where one good season now, and you're like, okay, that's 3 consecutive seasons of progress and output at the age, again, of 20. And if people are judging other things or criticizing him in other aspects, just go and remind yourself of the progression of those numbers, because that's the most telling indication of progress.
That's a whole lot of logic you're speaking, Ben. It's a breath of fresh air to hear that. And one last thing that I want to ask you while you're here with me. It would be foolish of me not, considering what you go through on a weekly basis. The rumour mill obviously goes into overdrive regarding Manchester United. And from what I pick up from my own workings and from individuals that I speak to, you have the increased speculation about a number of players. Now, that's obviously going to accelerate tenfold with a new manager coming in. But you've got the likes of Alphonso Davies at Bayern Munich and Jeremie Frimpong, both Bundesliga players that United are tracking and are interested in. And then obviously you have a who's who list of sporting players, as you've mentioned, including that certain number 9 who used to ply his trade in Coventry of all places. What can you tell us from the channels that you've been conversing with in recent weeks about anything that you're hearing about Manchester United in January and the summer with the new manager?
Yeah, I think January will be relatively quiet, but new manager, they may want to back him with 1 or 2, but I don't think we're going to see what Chelsea did a couple of Januaries ago, for example, because Manchester United won't know in January whether they're definitely on course or even in the mix for Champions League. So the last thing that you want to do is spend big in both summer and in January, and then find the real summer where maybe Amorim feels like he wants a springboard ahead of next season. You're restricted financially. I also think that a lot of these players that are linked are not available in January either. So I'll be staggered if Viktor Gyokeres goes anywhere in January, but there may be a window of opportunity to pre-agree something in January to try and jump ahead of the market. But there's no indication yet on that front that Manchester United will move, other than a natural link with Ruben Amorim. There's plenty of clubs that are looking at Viktor Gyokeres, but there's no real history of Manchester United. It was Chelsea that were looking and they ruled him out. It's Arsenal. And if they can't get Alexander Isak, or if Benjamin Sesko doesn't go in 2025, then Gyokeres could go very high on their list. So it's probably fair to say if Manchester United came calling for Viktor Gyokeres, he'd say, brilliant, I'd love to go and play under Ruben Amorim. And that's the advantage of somebody coming for a player at their former club. But it's not set in stone there. And even though it's true in the summer, we're not going to be talking about Gyokeres and 100 million release clause like we were last summer. We're looking more in the region of 75 million euros. That is a heck of a lot of money for Manchester United to find at this particular stage without any guarantee right now. Let's hope it changes, of European football. So Gyokeres in the summer will be a topic of conversation. I think Omar Mamouche is another one to watch. Alphonso Davies, the feeling has always been Real Madrid, and that he'll leave on a free transfer if nothing is agreed in terms of a new deal at Bayern. But let's wait and see, because we said exactly the same thing for months and months and months about Lenny Yoro and how Real Madrid were the front runners and the player was going to join, and Manchester United found a way to get it done. The only real difference is that if Davies doesn't sign a new contract, then you're not looking at that 1 year wait. So the window was open with Lenny Yoro because Manchester United said to Lille, we'll pay what it takes now. And Real Madrid said, don't worry, there's no panic. We'll lowball because the player wants to join us. So if they don't accept our offer, he'll wait. And then in a year's time, he'll join. And in the end, Yoro said, one club wants me now and is prepared to pay what it takes. I'm going to change my mind. Davies might just wait and see whether that Real Madrid opportunity materialises. Frimpong is a very interesting one and a good fit in this system. It's true that Manchester United have looked and like him. Of course, Leverkusen don't want him to leave, but there's a realistic possibility that he goes somewhere in summer 2025, but not, again, January. And then one thing I would look out for if United do move in January, and this is not to discount any of the striker names that we've alluded to or others to throw in the mix, but there is that sort of Manchester United almost Glazers history of working out, is there an inspired stopgap? Is there somebody a bit older that we can bring in? And Choupo-Moting, for example, was the name a lot of people were discussing last January. That kind of profile, not him specifically now, but that kind of profile. Someone a bit older, or someone that's a bargain, or somebody on a loan deal, just to offer that depth and support to get you through to the summer, and then you know where you stand. So this may not be as active or exciting January comparative to the summer, but it may be a time for some smart and opportunistic business without breaking the bank, and then backing Amorim in summer 2025. I think the last name that I would throw into the mix, although I'd be surprised if anything happens mid-season, But Jonathan David is going to be in demand, and Manchester United are another club, along with Newcastle. Chelsea had a little look last summer. He's somebody that is in great goal-scoring form and is a free transfer come the end of the season. Somebody could go in January and for a nominal fee, see whether or not there's a chance there, just because do you want to cash in a little bit or do you want to just wait? But I think from David's point of view, the more likely scenario is that he'll let that run into free agency, and it will maximize his opportunity, therefore, to go to the club of his choice and potentially even to get a bigger wage or a sign-on fee. And I think David would make sense to Manchester United if they were buying him and then still looking at a more traditional goal scorer, and then have two options, and then they'd have to judge, obviously, where Xerxes plays, and then you'd have sort of three up front to play around with. But I think if it gets to the summer, then David will be lower down on Manchester United's list of names they're talking about, because there will be other strikers available in the market. So it's interesting because it's very early stages. You're dealing with Ashworth, still pretty much brand new. Barada, again, only started during the summer. Amorim, at the time of recording, hasn't even got his visa. 5 new staff members that will all input to the recruitment. So it's really easy to make links, and it's really easy to say who might he raid at Sporting, and it's really easy to get people excited with the rumour mill. But the cold, hard facts at the moment are, as boring as it sounds, United don't know yet, because their manager's only 2 days in, his staff haven't started, and the recruitment team need to work with Amorim and this new system before committing to big spend, because they can't afford another window, January or the summer, where they make another big spend that's impetuous, and it turns out that actually the decision-making wasn't quite right. So they have to be a bit more cautious, and that also lends itself towards ticking over the season in January with only opportunism. Don't break the bank. And then, of course, by summer, Amorim will have had the best part of a full season minus 11 games. So when they then make those decisive and maybe bigger spend decisions in the summer, there'll be a bit more substance and a bit more thought and consultation behind them.
Well, that is absolutely insightful and fantastic. As always, it is an absolute pleasure to chat with you, my friend. And anybody listening, if you're not already aware of his work, be sure and check Ben out across his socials. And you can get in touch with us at the theatre_of_red across every single social platform, from TikTok to Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Kindly subscribe wherever you are listening today. You can leave a review if you have a spare 30 seconds. Each and every single one of them means the world to me and helps to enhance the footprint of the show. Until next week, enjoy the international break. Catch you all very, very shortly.